Welcome to the Glenn Mercer Show, where we talk all things vegan. If you're not already vegan, no worries, we'll get you there. If you are, tune in for health advice, information on climate change, and all the damage done by our most destructive industry, animal agriculture. We'll also talk cooking, theater, film, and culture. My 2 reasons for starting this podcast: to entertain, to inform, and to make people vegan. Oh, that's 3. Shit. Welcome to the Glenn Mercer Show. You can find us across all your favorite podcast platforms. You could find us on YouTube. And please remember to subscribe. If you subscribe, it costs you nothing. But for every person who subscribes, I get $1 million. So it's very good for me. So please subscribe. My guest today, I have just met. His name is Brendan Kessler. He is a postgraduate researcher and PhD candidate in nutrition at the Rowett Institute in the United Kingdom. Prior to joining the Rowett Institute, Brendan earned an undergraduate degree in exercise science, a graduate degree in health administration, and another graduate degree in nutrition science. The man just collects degrees. His research explores the human health benefits from consumption of fruits and vegetables, dietary fiber, and fiber-bound polyphenols. He's also employed as the R&D Innovation Director for Van Drunen Farms and Futureceuticals, where he focuses on creating innovative nutrition solutions to increase consumption of fruits, vegetables, dietary fiber, and phytonutrients, just the things I want to eat. Brendan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute honor to be here, Glenn. So wonderful to meet you, and thank you for having me on.
Well, it's great to have somebody on who is an up-and-coming expert on nutrition. How did that happen? Did you want to study nutrition as a child?
Yeah, nutrition, I think, so I guess when I was really little, I probably became very interested first in cardiovascular disease. So I became very, very interested in cardiovascular disease. And then I think somewhere along the way, I became fascinated by the idea that we could prevent cardiovascular disease. And so nutrition really became kind of my primary focus. In undergrad, as you mentioned kind of in the introduction, I started actually in the exercise science world, and then eventually kind of later in life was able to go back for formally studying nutrition science. But yes, to answer your question, nutrition was always a huge focus of mine. Just took a bit of a roundabout path for that to become my complete career focus.
Now, where did you grow up, and were you eating McDonald's hamburgers as you grew up?
No, I wasn't. I'm very thankful. So I grew up in rural Ohio. Grew up in a small town called Bellefontaine, Ohio. And I have to give a lot of credit to my mom and dad. They actually were very nutrition focused. So my parents were, we might kind of say hippies, perhaps that met in Nashville, Tennessee, in the 1960s, and they were really big into supporting local farms and buying organic food. We lived close to Amish country, so we would routinely go to the Amish markets. And my mom really loved to cook, so it was actually very kind of very blessed to grow up in a house where my mom and dad really grew a lot of their own fruits and vegetables in a garden behind our home. And so I would say for the most part, I ate very healthy growing up. I will say that sometimes as a kid, I think you do see what other people eat in school. So there was certainly some going to friends' houses and getting exposed to junk food and soda. So that certainly did come into play. But for the most part, at home, we actually ate very healthy. And I think probably fast forward 20 years, certainly that somewhere in there that laid a foundation for my own interest in human nutrition and disease prevention.
Well, a shout out to mom and dad for feeding you healthy food, but it wasn't vegan, was it?
It was not vegan, no. And actually, even as of today, I still am really the only plant-based kind of vegan eater in my entire family. I will say over the past couple of years, my dad is in his mid 70s now. My dad has actually become very interested in plant-based nutrition, and so we did, kind of a little fun kind of family challenge. I think it was probably the beginning of last year, where I just kind of threw out a challenge for anyone that wanted to join, and my dad jumped right in and said, "Hey, I'm going to really do around 16 weeks and just focus on nothing but whole food, plant-based nutrition." And he joined me for that, and it just stuck. He was thrilled with the way he felt with the results. And so I think my dad today is actually probably the closest and has probably started pushing towards probably at least 90% vegan and plant-based now, which is awesome and shows that it's never too late to begin.
Hey, Dad, if you're listening, keep going.
That's
Keep
right.
going and subscribe to the show. I get $1 million. Now, when you started studying nutrition, you weren't a vegan then either, were you?
I had to think about that for a minute. When I started studying nutrition, so when I went back to graduate school and formally studied nutrition science, I had just become plant-based. When I started my academic career in the early 2000s in exercise science, I was not vegan or vegetarian then, and even I think probably was still exposed to a fair amount of that sports nutrition approach, where it is very dominant. You get into the arguments around quality of animal proteins and things like that. So I was exposed to a fair amount of that, became vegan right around probably 8 or 9 years ago. And I've been studying nutrition formally for around the past 7 years. So when I went formally back for my Master of Science, I had converted to a predominantly plant-based diet at that point.
Okay. Do you remember, was there any particular piece of evidence you came across that made you say, that does it? It's been looking better and better for the plants, but this really convinced me. No more animal foods.
Yeah, so my story is probably a little bit extreme, where I think a lot of people, may convert over to a plant-based diet more slowly. Perhaps they start skipping meat one day a week, or they have ethical concerns or climate concerns or other things that kind of slowly get them into that. For me, honestly, I had a health scare. So I
Ah,
was working for a decent sized corporation. We had been acquired. We had a routine health screening as part of that organization. I actually missed it, and I think the HR department called me, and so now I had to go and kind of do a full laboratory screening. And at this point, I think I was in my early 30s. I loved to exercise. I had come from that world. I thought of myself as someone who was fairly healthy, didn't expect to get any kind of poor or negative results. And honestly, I was very shocked to get a report with, if you've seen one of these kind of health screenings with all kinds of the alarming, red font and kind of red
right.
circles on it. And I had some issues with blood sugar, but perhaps more extreme were actually all of the lipid and cholesterol values. So
How
that
high
led
was your
me.
cholesterol?
My cholesterol my recollection is that it was in the high 240s or low 250s. So it was at
Hmm.
the point where a doctor would have traditionally recommended a medical intervention in order to kind of from a pharmaceutical approach, start reducing that level of cholesterol. And I think what I had in my favor at this point was had developed a lot of research skills. I fully believed that nutrition really had a massive impact on our overall health. And honestly, Glenn, I don't think it took me more than a day to do some very quick research. Perhaps a little shout out to another a kind of a well-known Cleveland family, but very quickly ran across the work of Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn,
Okay.
who lives not too far from me in Cleveland, but very quickly came across this mountain of evidence. on what a plant-based diet could do. And I think it interested me from a few angles. One, from the perspective of eliminating a lot of the foods that were raising my cholesterol, but then also increasing foods that were rich in fiber and phytochemicals that have the ability to decrease cholesterol. So
And
my
I'll add a third one.
please, yeah,
Lowering the amount of fat in your diet, which will cause your liver to produce less cholesterol.
absolutely, absolutely. So really kind of coming at it from a dietary approach had multiple benefits. For me, I thought I will give this a try. And so I adopted a vegan diet literally overnight.
Hmm.
And of course, at first, it's not perfectly smooth. Growing up in the Midwest, being indoctrinated in exercise science, that almost becomes kind of part of your culture. And so when you are eating different foods, it does feel a little bit perhaps strange at first. And I think I think what ultimately happened to me is that over the course, I went back 6 months later to get my blood tested. My cholesterol had fallen significantly. Over the course of a year, my cholesterol fell over 100 points.
There you
It,
go.
it has maintained today. So thankfully, I've worked with wonderful, helpful physicians that encouraged me to play with my diet, and we're also intrigued by the power of a plant-based diet. Being at the Cleveland Clinic now, of course, we're just amazed by the fact that how dramatically I could lower my cholesterol using a plant-based diet. So that is what led me into a plant-based diet. That is what mainly kind of keeps me in a plant-based diet today. I won't jump too far ahead, but I will say, I think when you start eating a plant-based diet, you start reading the literature out there. I came to become vegan primarily from a health and nutrition perspective. I think at some point you, of course, also get exposed to a lot of the ethical concerns, environmental concerns. So I think, nutrition led me to become a vegan. Many other things have made me love this overall lifestyle, this community, and will certainly keep me someone who eats a plant-based diet for the rest of my life.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I came to it from health because there was so much heart disease in my family,
Yeah,
and but along the way, all those other reasons came into play. Did
same.
you did you get to meet Dr. Esselstyn along the way?
I've never met Dr. Esselstyn. There are occasionally, I think, some things around the Cleveland area that I have tried. I've had a few schedule conflicts. My travel schedule's crazy. He actually does do a local conference still that I've tried to attend. I've had a few conflicts, but I just got home a few weeks ago from California and had the pleasure of literally running in to his son, Rip,
Oh,
on the show floor of Natural Products Expo West. And so I went right up to Rip and introduced myself and my you Cleveland background, and we had a wonderful conversation with Rip and his team. And it's fun to meet him, and I just couldn't have been a more warm and kind of welcoming person. So I had a really
yeah.
really nice brief chat with Rip in California, and that was a pleasure.
Yeah, Rip's a great guy and he's a great asset to the plant-based movement.
Yes, he is.
Um, so you are an expert on fiber. Tell us, how are Americans doing at getting fiber? Are Americans getting enough fiber? And if not, how close are they?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So Americans are not doing very well on dietary fiber consumption. I think the latest time that this data was what was run, the statistics were somewhere around 97% of men in the United States, 90% of women. So around 94 to 95% of all Americans in the United States are not even meeting what the USDA or HHS call the adequate intake level. This is
Which is probably pretty low.
probably pretty low. And honestly, it's probably more of kind of a baseline metric. I
Mhm.
think anyone consuming a whole food plant-based diet, I mean, I probably consume at least triple the adequate intake level. It's not uncommon for me to hit 60, 80, 90 grams of dietary fiber in a day. Of course, you kind of work up to that as you're adopting a more and more whole food diet. But yeah, Americans are not consuming anywhere close to enough. Interestingly, now that I'm studying in the United Kingdom, I've had a chance to look at some of those global statistics. I've been interested to see kind of how that follows. And interestingly enough, although the United States does tend to perhaps be the worst in terms of dietary fiber consumption, any country that I have come across that has a recommendation for dietary fiber, then a national survey where they study and actually compile how much fiber people consume, to my knowledge, there is really not a country around the world that is consuming enough dietary fiber. So really, in a nutshell, that kind of says as more and more people around the world have abandoned a whole food diet, are now living in large cities, consuming more and more refined foods, less whole foods. This becomes a real problem for any culture. The root causes of why we don't consume enough fiber, at least for the United States, we have a 90% gap in vegetable consumption, around an 80% gap in fruit consumption. That also includes juice. So the statistics are a little bit worse if you eliminate juice from that statistic. And then we also have an interesting grain challenge where Americans consume lots and lots of grain. But if you look at the statistics, it's very interesting. We have roughly a 98% gap in whole grain consumption, but a significant overconsumption in refined grain. So we're consuming lots and lots of grain across the United States, but these are heavily refined grains where a lot of that beneficial fiber has actually been removed. So those are really kind of the foundational pieces that lead to this very significant fiber gap in the US.
Right. So if somebody buys bread and they look at the ingredient list and it says wheat flour, they might think that's good, but there's a difference between wheat flour and whole wheat flour, isn't there?
There
And then
certainly
there's
is.
then there's sprouted whole
Sure.
grains, which I would assume is even better than wheat flour, right? Or
It,
whole wheat flour.
It probably is, and I don't have enough knowledge around the sprouted side, but certainly the less we refine something, the more that it keeps all of its outer layers intact, the better. And that really goes for fruit, for vegetable. Juice is kind of an extreme example, but I've published some work where I just took a look at comparing a whole orange to orange juice. And it is dramatically different, of course, in its in the amount of fiber that is still present. So the more we refine foods, typically the more dietary fiber we refine out of those foods.
And so when you drink the orange juice, you're getting a flood of sugar with the less fiber.
That's correct. That's correct. And I think there are a few maybe interesting things there. One is that based on kind of the quantity of orange juice you might consume compared to a whole orange. So you're not only kind of missing that dietary fiber because you're really just squeezing and you're just getting those soluble, kind of sweet parts. A child that consumes a glass of juice, well, they might be getting the equivalent sugar from more than just one orange. That can easily go to two or even kind of three oranges, depending on the size of that juice glass. So we're consuming, the approximate sugar of multiple oranges, but eliminating all of that fiber. And that fiber really has a very powerful effect at slowing down the metabolism of that sugar. But one of the other things, and we may get into this just a little bit later, but I think a lot of us have historically thought in the field of nutrition that the antioxidants were probably pretty good in juice. And it's very interesting, while there certainly are antioxidants in juice, one of the really fascinating things we know now, and this is biased, of course, this is my own PhD research, but one of the really interesting things is that we're now learning that a lot of antioxidants are actually physically bonded in nature to the dietary fiber. So as we think about in the United States separating out all of that dietary fiber, we're also actually eliminating a very powerful source and form of antioxidants that are physically bonded to that dietary fiber. That's why I'm so big on getting fiber in food and not necessarily kind of the more isolated, purified fibers. And we can chat more about that, but these are really unique antioxidants. Certain fruits might actually have as much as 65% of its antioxidants are locked inside of that dietary fiber. So not something that we want to throw away. And then those antioxidants end up gaining very interesting properties, maybe based on the fact that it's tied to that fiber. But in a very kind of brief look, they can really survive a lot of the digestive process. And they end up in our colon, where through the action of the gut microbiome, those antioxidants can be released, utilized, and even transformed into other metabolites. So that goes a little bit beyond fiber, but all that to say that fiber is much more perhaps than just fiber, but really looking at it from a whole food perspective, there are these amazing polyphenols that are bound to that dietary fiber.
Well, I'm not an expert on nutrition like you are, but I look for patterns. And the
Yep.
pattern I see is that every year, every time I look for new studies, there are more and more and more benefits being attributed to fiber. That's
Yes.
the pattern. Next year, we'll know about even more benefits of fiber. So when you see that pattern, you have to say to yourself, fiber may be a very good thing. And maybe
Yeah.
we shouldn't all be asking ourselves, where do you get your protein, but where do you get your fiber?
I love that. I think that's a wonderful question. I think yeah, if you look at just the macronutrients that we're deficient in, that is the logical question.
Yeah.
We spend so much time, of course, obsessing over protein and always laugh. I think Garth Davis has said this multiple times, but drives him crazy when you go to a restaurant and you order something and they say, would you like to add a protein on that? And of course, I to some degree, I understand what they mean, but really it's fiber that is this massive deficiency across the United
Mm.
States. So it is interesting. And to your point, I think the fiber research has really changed where, maybe if we went back 50 years ago, when Dr. Kellogg kind of first introduced the United States to dietary fiber, that was really probably just about advancing the movement of things through the intestinal tract, helping with gut motility, decreasing constipation. That was really kind of this effect of dietary fiber. Today, we know a lot more about the gut microbiome. And so we know that as these fibers survive metabolism and they reach the environment of the microbiome within the colon, these fibers can actually be utilized and transformed into all types of things. And now, if we add the polyphenols on top of that, that's just a whole new kind of understudied area of science that over the next decade we're going to find out a lot more about what these fiber and polyphenols and carotenoids and other things that are attached to that fiber are doing within the microbiome.
Now, fiber could actually affect your mood, can't it?
Yes, it can. Yes, and I suspect that there are probably, like anything within nutrition, a lot of times there are multiple mechanisms that could happen. But certainly one of them could be, or at least a primary one could be through the action of the microbiome, where that fiber is utilized, and then you have certain bacterial strains capable of producing metabolites like short chain fatty acids. These things can
Exactly.
reach circulation and have benefits systematically far outside of the gut. So I believe there's actually a researcher at a wonderful school in Belgium, KU Leuven, and she was I may get this wrong, but I believe she was a neuropsychologist, and she has actually turned her entire research focus to the psychological effects of dietary fiber, heavily looking at the association of fiber consumption and depression. I was able to hear
Right.
her speak a few years ago. So to your point, there's a flood of new research on the mental health benefits of dietary
Right.
fiber, which is
The
fascinating.
product the production of butyrate in
Yes,
particular, I think, right?
yes, that's right.
So eat fiber for your mood. You'll feel better.
That's right.
Um, now, has there been any improvement in the American consumption of fiber? We've heard about fiber for a while.
Mm,
going back to Kellogg, as you mentioned.
yeah.
Um, has anything improved, let's say, in the last 10 years, as far as you know?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. To my knowledge, there really hasn't been too much improvement. And I think the reason, because again, it really goes back to those foundational food categories of whole grains, whole fruits, whole vegetables. Now, when the next version of the dietary guidelines comes out, that scientific committee will publish a lot of data. They'll take an updated look at the National NHANES survey. And so we'll see some updated data, and we'll see over the last couple of years whether anything has really shifted. But really, if we look at the last 10 or 15 years, there has not been too much of an overall change. And I think there are probably kind of three main problems. One is whole grain consumption remains very low. Secondarily, vegetable consumption has modestly increased, but not increased nearly enough. And a lot of times, the type of vegetables that are increasing are maybe not the ones that we would most recommend. So it's not necessarily broccoli and spinach and Brussels sprouts and things that are really, really nutrient dense. But the third thing that I think is it's personally fascinating to me, because I do a lot of research on fruit, is that fruit, the data actually shows that there's actually a decline in overall fruit consumption. And I think that is fascinating and also very concerning. This is speculation. We don't know exactly why that is, but I suspect people have a fear of the sugar that is contained in
Um,
fruit. And so now we are typically seeing people are fruit is normally consumed in the morning. That's the most popular time in the United States to consume fiber. And so the average maybe frequency of fruit consumption is probably only once per day, where vegetables are consumed a little bit more. So if we start missing that morning fruit, now we have and forgive me, I don't remember the statistic off the top of my head. It is in a paper I wrote somewhere, but I think it's around 20 to 30% of American adults may now consume no fruit whatsoever. So that is a very frightening trend. And especially as I speculate more and more about the power of these polyphenols that are within that fiber, then all of a sudden things like berries become really, really beneficial for the human gut. So that's a concerning trend we see. So all that to say, I have not seen much change in terms of overall fiber consumption across Americans, but I am looking forward to getting an updated look from the latest data here later this year.
yeah. The USDA will put out their annual food plate or food pyramid, they used to call it,
Yeah.
recommendations. And it would say something like 3 to 5 fruits and vegetables per day, or 5 to 7, or something like that. And I remember I called up somebody once at the USDA. I said, why do you put an upper limit on it? 3 to 5 or five to
Sure.
seven. He said, is something going to happen to me if I go over 7? And he said, oh, no, that's not an upper limit. So I said, so why do you say 5 to 7? It's a recommended range. Well,
Sure.
what's the difference between a recommended range and an upper limit? It's a way of expressing number. Why are
Sure.
they doing it? They're doing it to make room for the dairy.
Sure.
Been doing it to make room for the meat. But I will probably have, I don't know, 15 fruits and vegetables a day in terms of servings. I don't,
Oh, yeah.
nothing. You don't go to the hospital if you go above the 7.
No, certainly not. And to your point, Glenn, I think when you adopt a more whole food plant-based diet, over time, I think that I think kind of it naturally evolves into probably kind of a healthier and healthier diet as you become more in tune with with the research. You become kind of more technically capable of plant-based cooking. And so this just gets better and better and easier where now it just kind of happens like a clockwork. But I remember Dr. Michael Greger had an app for a while, and he may still have it. We can kind of count the amount of unique plants that you have a day, and that was really focused on getting people to become more aware of the diversity of their diet. But to your point, when you follow a whole food plant-based diet, sometimes, my lunch is typically going to be some kind of very complex kind of Buddha bowl, I think they call them, where I might have 6 or 7 different things. I might have a sauce that I made that's a hummus or some kind of pesto with additional 3 or 4 lots of spices. So, I could get through Michael Greger's checklist and
Yeah.
I haven't even sat down to dinner yet. So this is
Yeah.
something that I think just gets easier and easier as you become more experienced consuming a plant-based diet.
All right, if you've ever wanted to show off your plant based lifestyle and do it in style, here's your chance. We have some of the most amazing t shirts, hats, accessories, coffee mugs, and more at shop.realmeneatplants.com. We have statement t shirts that will bring a smile to everyone's face. I love the I Want Tofu Tonight tee. Plus, we have podcast tees, Real Women Eat Plants gear, Real Kids Eat Plants, and Real People Eat Plants, just in case men, women, and kids didn't cover it all. Yeah, we love you and love that you want to show off that healthy lifestyle of yours. Again, check out our high-quality gear at shop.realmeneatplants.com and enjoy.
Now, if somebody's been eating an American diet and they're getting just 10 grams of fiber a day,
Mm,
and we want them to at least quintuple that,
sure.
um, they probably shouldn't do that overnight. Is that right? They might want to gradually increase.
I believe that's a good recommendation. Yeah, because fiber is going to be heavily fermented within the environment of the colon. So if we think about that, there are microbes, there are healthy bacteria that are required to kind of break that down. So for example, and I can just use myself as an example because I came from an exercise science background where unfortunately I was consuming a lot of animal protein historically. So when you first start to shift over to a plant-based diet, now my protein sources are heavily around beans and lentils and tofu and fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, etc. So as you switch over, you are consuming a lot of dietary fiber, and you will notice at first a GI impact. You might notice that in terms of kind of frequency of having to use the bathroom. You could notice some level of kind of gas and bloating. But what I would say to people is really kind of encouragement to hang in there because that is a very short-term effect. Your body will adapt very, very quickly as you eat the right kinds of healthy, whole plant-based foods. Your body, your microbiome will respond. Your microbiome will shift. Today I've been vegan for around 9 years. It is nothing for me to sit down. I'm a very busy person, so at lunch sometimes I'm kind of underprepared, and so I might eat an entire can of garbanzo beans that I've roasted. That has virtually no effect. I have no GI symptoms, kind of whatsoever from eating that amount. But yeah, someone that watches me do that consumes a more animal-based diet might say, how can you consume a whole can of beans? Aren't you going to be, using the bathroom for the next 3 days? And it's just, my microorganisms are they thrive off that. So it is something to that's a long-winded way of saying you're absolutely right. I think people should modestly increase fiber, probably increasing that a few grams, per day. Kind of so if you eat 10 to 15 grams a day, bump that to 18 for a week, then, keep going and keep going. But to your point, don't stop. There's not necessarily a limit on that. So keep going and make, nutrient dense, nutrient rich foods the core of your diet, and all of the rest of the issues on how many phytochemicals and fiber, that all becomes a non-issue when you're really consuming a whole food plant-based diet.
Right. And I think, of course, most people won't know how many grams of fiber they're getting a day, but if they just start by eating one more fruit, one more vegetable a day, and then two more
Yeah,
fruits, two more vegetables, and servings of vegetables.
that's
Um,
exactly right.
Dr. Will Bolshevitz wrote that wonderful book, Fiber Fueled,
I
and
think I
his
have it behind
mantra,
me somewhere. It's a
okay,
wonderful book.
yes, it
I,
is. And his mantra is diversity of plants.
I, I
There it is.
literally
There it
actually,
is. Dr.
and
Will,
that was
we're
not planned,
promoting
but
your
I actually
book.
literally have it on my desk. It's a wonderful reference. I have not met Will, but he is, he's really interesting from a fiber perspective, because of course he comes from a medical background,
Yeah.
but he also has a wonderful knowledge of the actual academic research as well. So really, really unique. And I love listening to Will. Always kind of joke he's like my long lost brother, because we have such a similar kind of philosophy towards dietary fiber consumption. So he's a wonderful person to recommend people listen to.
I agree wholeheartedly. I've never met the man, but he his mantra, diversity of plants, is something I have in my mind. You know, if I'll take a sandwich, I'll say, okay, let's say it's a tempeh sandwich. Okay, I'll add tomato, I'll add scallion, I'll add
Yeah.
leafy greens. What other plants can I'll add sprouts, and just you go through the day thinking more diversity of plants, the more you add, the better.
Absolutely. And I think too, I mentioned, I mean, my schedule can be very, very chaotic. And so sometimes when you're busy, you kind of get in these routines of I've kind of got my core things that kind of found the foundation of my diet. But I've just started getting really creative where I eat a lot of hummus. But when I make hummus now, it used to just be, chickpeas and tahini, a little bit of garlic, other spices. But now I may add, like, I think last week I added edamame and broccoli, took that with me to the UK. Lots of lemon. This week I'm planning on adding a little bit of walnuts. I'm adding pomegranate. I'm adding beets to it. So even just things that can be fairly ordinary can be easily transformed to have more diversity. Or when I do consume nuts, for example, rarely do I consume one. I will make kind of like an almond butter, but I will include flax seeds, hemp seeds, cinnamon, other things. And so just finding these little ways to add, but that really stacks up. You start to get 20, 30 more spices, herbs, plants a day, and that's a wonderful way to add some additional diversity, especially for kind of busy on the go people.
Now, I'm going to bring us back in the conversation to 20 minutes ago or so when you told us about your high cholesterol before you went on this diet.
Yeah,
And there was a question I meant to ask you then, and it slipped by. So I'm going to ask you now.
sure.
You made a comment about how working with physicians in your area, you got recommendations for how to improve your cholesterol. So beyond giving up the animal-based foods, were there any particular foods
Hmm.
or supplements that were recommended to you that you used?
Yeah, I would say most of that at that stage was my own research, and or was the research of Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn as I read his book on reversing heart disease. So a lot of that research what was on my own. Later, when I relocated, so at this point, when I went vegan, I was living in Jupiter, Florida. Several years later, I relocated to Cleveland, and of course, in Cleveland, the Cleveland Clinic is kind of our primary healthcare provider. So at the Cleveland Clinic was where I started to really have dialogue with my kind of primary care physician about how to maintain that for a long period of time, because I had kind of selected unique doctors at the clinic that had a wonderful background in nutrition science, and that's somewhat unique. And the Cleveland Clinic is large enough where they have some people that also went for a master's in nutrition, and so they're really it's a special that they have that approach to nutrition. But when I started, I immediately gave up animal protein and also gave up all dairy. So at this point, I was eating a very, very strict vegan diet. Over the past probably five or so years, I've kind of wavered in between, I say like 98 to 100% vegan. So there's been some international travel that's gotten kind of tricky, but for the most part, I really try to stick to a fully vegan diet where possible. So it was giving up all of the kind of saturated fat heavy animal protein, saturated fat heavy dairy, and then simultaneously, I think replacing that with protein sources that were also rich in dietary fiber. So I think that's one of the big switches. So is not only just eliminating the animal products, but also bringing in a diet that is very rich in dietary fiber. We know there's been a very long connection between fiber consumption and its ability to decrease various lipids and cholesterol. And then I also think that there's probably a connection between the phytochemicals that we consume as well. So really, it was the elimination of animal products and the replacement of those with nutrient-rich, fiber-rich whole foods. And that can be
Oh,
pretty extreme. I mean, if you're switching out from a chicken breast that has virtually no dietary fiber, and now garbanzo beans replace it in that meal, you might have 8 to 15 grams of dietary fiber just in that meal. And now, if you're putting that in, like I do, a big salad with hemp seeds and peppers and cucumbers and olives, I mean, you're easily consuming 20 plus grams of fiber per meal. That's probably my average today is well over 20 grams of fiber per meal.
now you mentioned phytochemicals. Are there any particular herbs or spices that you gravitate towards?
Yeah, it's a good question. I like so this is just kind of I'm going to answer this kind of randomly, but I mentioned a few times kind of when life gets very busy, sometimes you need kind of quick things. So one of the things that I do to kind of make plant-based eating very fun is I focus a lot on sauces because I think that actually sauces are one of the ways that really makes kind of food exciting. So, if historically before I became vegan, I might be eating, chicken and rice, and now maybe I'm eating tofu and rice instead, it's really the sauce I think is going to make that meal so different and delicious. So, coming from a history in South Florida, chimichurri is kind of one of my favorite sauces. So I make an oil-free chimichurri with a lot of red wine vinegar. That's going to have parsley, garlic, red pepper flake, and then lots of fresh oregano, which is unique. Although I'll use dried oregano from time to time. So that is a recipe that I learned in Miami that I have taken with me and just loved. So one of the things I do to make kind of life easy is a lot of times, maybe over the weekend, I will bake tofu. I'll roast several sheet pans of organic frozen vegetables that I have. And so I'm starting to build kind of in my refrigerator, kind of pots of, different fiber-rich proteins, lots of different vegetables. Well, then for dinner, on Monday, I might add chimichurri to that and kind of have kind of a South American style meal. The next day I might add a coconut-based sriracha to that. I might add some coconut aminos, and now that broccoli tofu dish kind of becomes more Asian style. I'm a little less experienced with Indian sauces, but I eat at a lot of Indian restaurants that make vegan food, and so I'm very attracted to their use of turmeric and ginger and other things. So, but most of my home cooking will tend to be probably Mediterranean, South American, or Asian, but kind of rotating nutrient-rich sauces on there, different hummuses like we talked about earlier. Just a great way to add, an extra dose of phytochemicals and 5 or 6 more plants to every meal.
Now, Brendan, I first came across you in an email from the fitness coach Maxim Seguin,
Yeah.
and he mentioned something that you said or wrote that stuck with me. It's the idea that you said, uh, it seems like there's a great controversy over nutrition, but that a lot of that is in the social media,
Mm,
and that when you know the scientists who are actually doing the research, there's more towards a consensus in
sure.
favor of plant-based nutrition. So could you speak about that? Do most scientists who you've gotten to know, most nutrition researchers, fall on our side of the spectrum? Are there many nutrition researchers doing the hard science who think
Mm.
that sausage is a good idea?
Yeah, so that is a really interesting question, and yes, Maxime is a wonderful friend of mine and a great plant-based advocate. I love his. I went through his program, and so he's become a wonderful friend over the last couple of years. But yeah, we did talk on his podcast a little bit because I think social media will definitely give people the impression that there's these kind of two sides that are kind of violently opposed to one another. And so I get asked very frequently from naive people, they will ask me, in nutrition science, is this like, when you're at the Rowett Institute, I mean, is this always the debate of the day? Is it, animal protein versus plant protein? And I think people are relatively surprised that that's a topic that very rarely comes up. And I think the reason that it rarely comes up is I think where the consensus is in nutrition science is that plants are highly, highly, highly beneficial. And in general, the more plants you consume, we know that that is leading to desirable health outcomes, to prevent disease, reverse disease. We know through the gut microbiome, which plants really form kind of the foundation of what feeds the gut microbiome. We know that that can lead to a more abundant and diverse gut microbiome. So in general, I think the perspective of the majority of academic nutrition scientists, and the reason there's not a lot of debate between animal and kind of plant protein sources, is really because there's such a foundational belief that plants really form the most important foundation for human nutrition. So there certainly could be debates within nutrition about, do you need to entirely eliminate all animal protein? Could you still consume a very small amount? For example, Marion Nestle, who is emeritus professor at NYU, I've heard her talk about that a little bit. So, there are smaller debates over, complete elimination versus partial. We see things like a Mediterranean diet pattern that do have very good health outcomes, and they certainly push towards elimination, but maybe not all elimination. But I think people are surprised. This is really not a huge area of debate within nutrition science.
So
The
there are
vast
not a lot of nutrition scientists saying, no, meat is very, very healthy. You have to get a lot of it.
I have personally never heard that in the field of nutrition
How
science.
about dairy? Are there a lot of nutrition scientists saying you got to eat a lot of cheese?
I have not heard that either. So I think probably where I think that tends to come more from the sports nutrition kind of bodybuilding side, where there's a bit more debate over what maybe leads to the greatest amount of muscle growth, muscle hypertrophy, etc. But in terms of overall human health and in terms of academic nutrition science, I personally am not generally, I have not heard a lot of debate across nutrition scientists. Again, because I think there is such a foundational belief that plants really should form at least the core of the human diet. And I think
So,
that's very, very well agreed upon.
so it's generally estimated that maybe 2%, maybe 3% of Americans are vegans.
Yes.
You're a nutrition scientist, you're a vegan. Take a guess. What percentage of nutrition scientists do you think are vegan?
That's a very interesting question. I would certainly say that I would suspect it to be much higher. I would certainly expect it to be much higher. And so, maybe it's, yeah, maybe it's probably, 10%, 15%. I mean, I think it would be a much higher percentage. It could even be higher than that. I think someone should do that study because it
Yeah.
would actually be a
Why
very
don't you do that
interesting
study,
and
Brendan?
powerful statistic. And you may have given me an idea, because I think
Yeah.
even with just a very simple survey, someone
Yeah.
could very, very quickly.
Do
But
that study. Just like we have the doctors and nurses health study,
yeah, of
the
course.
nutrition scientist nutrition study.
And that would be an interesting way too to cut through some of the social media stuff
Yeah.
that's out there and actually show people this is actually what the real academic nutrition science world believes. But the reason I say it like that is because this is just kind of me based on my experience, mainly in the UK, but also here in the US when I studied nutrition as well. But certainly when you go to a nutrition conference in the US, um, I go to conferences all over the world, have for many years. If it's not a nutrition conference, it can be sometimes pretty hard to find a plant-based option. But at a nutrition conference, I don't know if I've ever been to one that didn't have a pretty solid whole food plant-based offering for it. And the reason for that was demand,
Yeah.
because so many people signing up for that conference, checked the box that they indeed were, whole food plant-based. So I think it is a much higher percentage in the nutrition community, and I suspect probably an even more dramatic statistic would be the amount of animal protein consumed by nutritionists. Because I suspect even those that do consume animal protein, I suspect it is a much smaller percentage of their diet compared to the general public. Because in general, they're aware of the negative health benefits of animal protein and a simultaneous awareness of the health benefits of whole fruits and vegetables and whole grains. So
Uh,
I certainly hope we would find that.
I want you to do that study, Brendan.
I want to do that study. That's a very interesting statistic.
That'll be fascinating to read. Um, Now, let me tell you my theory, my approach to nutrition, and tell me if you think it has any validity.
Okay.
Um, for years I went to conferences, and of course I watch videos, and I have heard the leading plant-based speakers, as we all have in this movement. And so Dr. McDougall, the late great Dr. McDougall,
Yes.
always emphasized starch.
Mm,
He emphasized really where you get your fuel,
sure.
avoiding fatty foods, getting your fuel in a low fat way
Mm,
from whole starchy foods. He called people natural starchivores.
mm-hmm.
Dr. Furman and Dr.
Mm-hmm.
Greger emphasize foods that some might call superfoods, foods with a great deal of antioxidants,
Yeah.
foods with polyphenols, foods with a great deal of fiber. Dr. Furman has what he calls his G bombs. Dr.
Mm-hmm.
Greger has what he calls the Daily Dozen, I think.
Yes.
And they both agree, of course, on berries and greens and onions and so forth. Now, there's no real disagreement there in the sense that Dr. McDougall was never saying don't eat onions or don't
Sure.
eat berries. He just didn't emphasize it.
Sure.
He and so what I came up with is what I call the theory of fuel plus fortification. And by
Mm,
fortification, I don't mean fortifying foods with B vitamins. I
sure.
mean fortification against disease.
Mm-hmm.
So the fuel that humans need is the fuel that comes from starch.
Mm,
In order to get enough calories, enough energy to go through the day, you
mm,
can't go through the day on onions, as healthy
yeah.
as they are.
Sure.
You need your sweet potatoes, your rice.
Sure.
If you eat bread, your whole grain bread, you
Sure.
need to
Mm-hmm.
get your fuel. Even, I'll eat pasta. Sometimes it'll be whole wheat pasta. Sometimes it won't. It'll be lentil pasta.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
I don't look at pasta and say, this is the food that's going to protect me from cancer.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
I look at blueberries and I say, this is the food that's going to protect me from cancer. But I go through the day trying to get my fuel
Mm-hmm.
foods plus my fortification foods. You might
Yeah.
say the McDougall foods plus
Yeah.
the Gregor Furman foods.
Yeah.
And so look, if you're hungry, you don't say, give me some lettuce. I'm going to steam some greens now. If you're
Sure,
hungry, you want some pasta, you want some whole grain bread, you want a sweet potato, you want a potato.
sure. Hmm.
And it's not that, and sweet potatoes are wonderful because they are not only, they are fuel plus fortification.
Sure,
They satisfy your need for calories, plus they have antioxidants. Um, Beans the same way.
hmm,
And interestingly enough, beans and sweet potatoes are the foods that Dan Buettner found are in the blue zones with the longest lived populations. So
yes,
that's my view of nutrition, is that you
yeah,
you want to have fuel plus fortification. You want to get your fuel without getting fat. You don't want to get your fuel from
sure,
animal foods, because then you're getting the fat and the cholesterol.
sure,
You want to get your healthy fuel. So there's nothing wrong with whole grain bread if you want to eat it.
sure,
It's a fuel food. Just don't expect that to prevent disease. You
sure.
want to eat your fortification foods to prevent disease. How's that for a theory of nutrition?
Pretty solid. Yeah, very, very, very solid. I think I like the way that you have kind of combined all those approaches because, yeah, to your point, I mean, there are some amazing nutrient rich foods like garlic and onion, but those are not things that you'll be able to consume, 2,000 calories of
Right.
a given day. So, yeah, I think to your point, you are likely going to consume some of the higher starchier foods. So I kind of view it really very similar to you as looking at the diet and just trying to make the most nutrient dense choices along the way that are going to fill up and really meet my personal dietary requirements. Because the other thing I think that's heavily involved with our nutrition is there's a lot of people that will kind of say that this is really nutrition is a lot of times kind of this individual study, and while there certainly are things that are good for the entire population, we all have kind of a unique genetic composition, we have a unique microbiome composition, and we have unique requirements for our day. So my requirements might be significant, are definitely significantly lower, for example, than I have a friend at Baylor University that is an elite athlete. And so they
Mhm.
might have, double the caloric requirements that I have. So, I might be able to get away with consuming more nutrient dense foods, less starch, for someone that's extremely active doing ultra marathons, they might end up a lot more. So it really does depend on your goals, your genetics, what you need to really fuel your day. But overall, I think that approach is very wise. And I also think it's very important to note the emphasis on all those approaches on really mixing meals and having foods with a lot of complexity. So Walter Longo, for example, he will talk about one of his main meals and included in the blue zones in Sardinia, Italy, is a minestrone, which has pasta. So there's nothing, just wrong with pasta, but you will notice those people are generally not consuming just this enormous bowl of plain pasta. They're
Right.
consuming a smaller amount of pasta that's in a vegetable broth that has green beans, tomatoes, chickpeas. And so as we add all of that fiber, phytochemicals, complexity to it, I think from a blood sugar response standpoint, then we tend to kind of slow down that blood sugar response. And I do think probably blood sugar is something where the more consistent and stable our blood sugar is, probably throughout the day, that will also be very helpful to people to control cravings. And I think a lot of that is driven into how complex we make our food. So yeah, so to your point, slowing something down. So even when I have fruit, I don't worry about fruit at all because fruit comes with a natural package of fiber and phytochemicals. But by the time I add a scoop of unsweetened, kind of muesli and some almonds, other things in there, you're always adding a lot of complexity, even as a further impact, kind of slow and delay that glycemic impact.
Now, what about cooked versus raw? What percentage of your diet do you think is cooked versus raw? And do you think there are any general rules on that, or do you think everybody's individual and finds their own ideal percentage?
This is an interesting question, and I'll be very honest, Glenn. This is something that I have not personally looked into and researched. So this is certainly a question that fascinates me, but I don't honestly know the answer well enough to make a recommendation. So I will say that I tend to mix raw and cooked foods throughout every single day, especially when I'm home. When I'm traveling, it is a little bit more difficult. So kind of walk you through, perhaps a kind of my own day. I eat fairly simply, but my morning is usually going to be muesli with a lot of berries, some kind of the mixed nut butter with cinnamon that I talked about earlier. Then for lunch is usually when I have most of my raw foods. So for lunch, I usually make a big salad. That's a personal preference for me. Because I'm very busy with work during the day. I don't eat too much starch at that point just because I tend to kind of my metabolism kind of maybe kind of slows down a little bit, and I might be tempted to nap at two, if at some point if I have too much. So I tend to operate a lot better off having a lighter lunch. So my lunch is usually, mixed greens, sprouts, hemp seeds, hummus, roasted garbanzo beans, peppers, cucumbers, olives, some kind of pesto. I make a vegan tzatziki that I love. So some kind of I don't use a lot of salad dressing. I tend to instead use like a hummus or a pesto or a vegan tzatziki that I make. So that tends to be my lunch. I might have a snack. My snack all of last week was I carried to Scotland with me. I had smoked tofu that I had chopped up in little pieces, roasted. It was delicious. Smoked tofu, and I had some little like organic oranges that I had. So that was my snack in the afternoon with usually a cup or two of green tea. And then at dinner time, I will have a bit more of a cooked meal. So that tends to be, I love Thai food. I eat a lot of Thai food. So it tends to be two, three, four different vegetables that are cooked with a very rich sauce, sometimes like a coconut curry, tofu, or tempeh in there. And then if I want something raw, a lot of times I'll have a bowl of kimchi to start. So to be honest, I kind of mix raw and cooked foods. I don't know enough to answer the question what the right percentage is, but I do see a value in combining and having some combination of raw foods that have a lot of enzymes, still very active, with combined with some cooked foods that may be easier to digest. So I
Well,
tend to combine them.
when I have oatmeal in the morning, I sometimes put some arugula in the
Yeah.
bottom of the bowl under the oatmeal, and I get some of my greens in, as Dr. Bolshevitz would say,
Yeah.
diversity of plants.
Well, I think too, it's interesting, as we just stick on this diet longer and longer and longer, it becomes very, very personal where there are things you like. I am a bit strange for breakfast that I don't have much of a sweet tooth. So I don't eat a lot of sweet foods. I like savory foods. So when I went vegan, having savory foods in the morning, you have to kind of think outside the box a little bit. But means when I'm home on the weekends, I might make like a scrambled tofu with lots of turmeric and garlic over Ezekiel toast. It's delicious. I might make a savory oatmeal, or I'll take quinoa and make that into like a porridge, but I've got a lot of savory things in there. So, and I'll even have lentil soup for breakfast in the morning. So I'm looking at this stage of my life for nutrient density and satiety and what helps me have the most productive day. So I will eat some things that the average American might look at and say, that is really probably not a traditional breakfast food. But I was kind of rocked out of my comfort zone. I was in a few years ago, was in Thailand, and I was in Thailand at a place where, breakfast for them, they don't have this strong connection of like breakfast is over here, this is lunch, this is dinner. And so a family in Thailand, might consume the same thing for that entire day. So my breakfast every morning was often very savory. It was usually rice and seaweed and something very like a very, very spicy sauce. So at first that was a little strange to have with my morning coffee. And then, over time, it just became normal to kind of have these unique savory breakfasts because I felt so good after having them. So now it's much more about the way I feel.
Now, you mentioned coconut earlier, and you mentioned Thai food, which often has a lot of coconut, I believe.
Yeah.
Um, who designed the coconut, and what the heck is wrong with this food that it has so much saturated fat? How did all this saturated fat get in a fruit? And I barely ever touch coconut because I look at the saturated fat and I say I might as well have a prime rib. There's so much saturated.
Sure.
Could all that saturated fat possibly be healthy
Yeah,
from
well,
a coconut?
it is a good question. I think, and this is a bit of speculation. This is kind of out of my normal research area, but yeah, certainly things like avocados. There are a few fruits or vegetables around the world, but certainly avocados and coconuts are probably the two most dominant ones that
Yeah,
have
but
very
the amount of saturated fat in an avocado won't compare with a coconut. There's
true.
fat, but not so saturated.
That's absolutely correct. Yeah. So the amount of saturated fat is very, very high in coconut. So I do have to be careful with that. I think, is it perhaps healthier than animal-based saturated fats? I would speculate that it probably is. Again, it's coming with that package that has fiber and phytochemicals. So I would argue that it's probably still healthier than animal-based saturated fats. At the same time, I have to be very careful to watch my weight and watch other things. So saturated fats is something that I have to watch. So I am very cognizant and careful with nut consumption, oil consumption, and saturated fats like coconut as well. So when I make, for example, my own curry, I do use a limited amount of kind of lower fat coconut milk. And so mine is a little different than you might get in a restaurant where I use a lighter coconut milk. And then I kind of expand it a longer way by using almond milk and then a lot of spices. So it is a much lighter version. So I'm not getting more than a few grams of that actual saturated fat. So I am careful about that. And then I also tend to avoid salad dressings. Um, Again, I think that's probably maybe somewhat personal, depends on your weight goals. But for me, I just prefer a hummus or something else. There's some fat there, so I've added like something like tahini. But I think salad dressings can be especially dangerous because, if you could get away with maybe a tablespoon, but if you go to a restaurant, I mean, it's just 4, 5, 6 tablespoons. So I tend to at home make a lighter salad where I mix a hummus or a tzatziki or something different that I've made that's more nutrient dense
Yeah,
and less fatty.
I'll squeeze a lemon over my
There you go.
salad or vinegar. Um, One of my real pet peeves is coconut oil. Because you go
Sure.
to the vegan section, the vegan processed foods in a grocery store, all the vegan cheeses are made with coconut oil. A lot of the fake
Yeah,
meats are made with coconut oil. And then you look at the saturated fat
it's
in
very
these,
high.
it'll be 6, 7, 8 grams in a serving, and people might be eating 2 or 3 servings.
Sure.
And then I think this is supposed to be the healthy section, the vegan section. This stuff
Sure.
should come with an angioplasty. So,
And this is
so
really interesting. I don't know how much you travel overseas, but in the UK, for example, the UK has a higher percentage of vegans than we have in the US. But the vegans in the UK are predominantly looking more from an ethical perspective or a climate perspective. So, what that means is that unlike a lot of the vegans in the US, which also have those concerns, but maybe coming at it more from a health approach where they're looking for if they want a burger, for example, they might make their own recipe with beans and quinoa, something at home. So in the UK, fast food restaurants all have vegan options. So McDonald's, Burger King, Pizza Hut, they all have fully vegan offerings that are loaded with saturated coconut fat. So I think this becomes a really big question, especially for the UK, where you see so many of those meat-based alternatives. I think certainly from an ethical, environmental perspective, they're interesting. I tend to come back to the foundation of nutrition being the nutrient density of whole fruits and vegetables and grains. And so if you are removing something like chicken and replacing it with fake chicken, I don't know if that actually puts more broccoli on your plate. I think the goal is to eliminate that chicken and put a healthy, nutrient-dense mixed meal of beans, lentils, vegetables, etc. on that person's plate. So I think this becomes really interesting scientifically, where cultures around the world are shifting to non-animal alternatives for ethical and environmental concerns. So I think I think more and more research will come out that shows that maybe those things are a little bit better, but they're not even close to eating a big plate of
Right.
whole nutrient dense foods.
Right. And that's why there's this ongoing debate in the vegan world about whether we should embrace these fake meats and even what I consider this myth of one day having lab meat. And
Sure.
I don't believe we're ever going to go to the grocery store and have an option of lab meat. But if we did, it would be terribly unhealthy.
Sure.
And what we need to emphasize, we already have, which is whole plant foods.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that really, I think, is the foundational, the powerful foundation of human nutrition are those whole, unadulterated, unprocessed, whole fruits, vegetables, and whole grains that really form this nutrient rich foundation for the overall human diet. Everything you need is right there.
Well, on that note, which is a good summary of your message, Brendan, um, uh, we'll uh, we'll let you go now and say that please continue your studies and write that paper
I
on
will.
on the percentage on the diet of nutrition scientists and what percentage are vegan and how much less animal protein they have in their diet, because that would be interesting to know how
Yeah.
the people who know something about nutrition what they eat.
I'm intrigued by that question. I think it's an easy one to do. So
Great.
stay tuned, and I'll have some conversations to see what's possible.
And come back on the show and give us the results.
I absolutely will. Glenn, thank you so much for having me. An absolute pleasure to meet you and be on your show. So thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much, Brendan. Keep up the good work.
Take care.
This has been the Glenn Mercer Show, where everyone listening turns vegan, regains their health, and annoys their friends and relatives. Find us on YouTube at The Glenn Mercer Show and across all your major podcast platforms. Don't forget to subscribe.